Well, thanks for the invitation to speak about my experiences on the York U campus around bird window collisions. Some of the background that I put in here is probably old news for a lot of you, but I wasn't quite sure just exactly the background of the audience this evening. So I thought I'd give a little bit of background about migration mortality and songbird declines, because that's really the context in many ways in which we're addressing the problem of bird window collisions. And then I'll talk briefly about the experience I had at York University, trying for years to get someone to listen to us about the bird window collision problem, not really having very good solutions at the time. And then things sort of coming together suddenly a couple of years ago, leading to the retrofitting, the treatment of some of our older buildings, which still stuns me today that it even happened. But it did, so that's good news. And then at the end, I'll sort of wrap up again, talking about migration mortality and the role that bird window collisions might play and might or might not play.
Yeah,
and
you might be interested in this. It's feminist icon.
Somebody's got to mute themselves out there.
Bird legends, and she's giving a talk for University of Guelph right now.
What's her name?
Bridget Stutchbury.
Oh.
She's incredible.
Hey, Alora, can you mute yourself, please?
Oh,
Say good things about me first, though.
I didn't know I was unmuted. I am so sorry, but I'm a big fan.
That's okay. So as I said, I'm not going to apologize again for the background, but some of you may not know this. Who knows? So when we talk about population declines of songbirds, a good question from the lay audience is, well, how do we know they're declining? And of course, the answer is that we've been doing these systematic breeding bird surveys for decades now, and they kind of act as a continental sort of health checkup on bird populations. And these were started in the 1960s, and by the 1970s, they were spread over a lot of North America. And I won't get into the details or how they're done, except that they're done reasonably systematically, very brief survey once a year. And it gives us like a really rough idea of what's going on with a particular bird species. And the sad news is that, birds are disappearing in North America. We have the example of the bobolink over here, which is a grassland bird, which has been going down precipitously since the 1970s at an alarming rate. It's lost over 50% of its population in this time. And then we also have birds in the opposite habitat, forest habitat, like the wood thrush, who also have lost about 50% in their overall population size in North America. And so this is one of the reasons why we need to address bird mortality and human or anthropogenic sources of bird mortality, because to some extent, that will be contributing to these population declines. And of course, there's many, many reasons that birds are declining, but certainly adult mortality is certainly one of those. And then using the breeding bird survey, again, a couple of years ago, Rosenberg from Cornell came out with this large study that kind of pulled together this loss of abundance across all species in North America, because there's so many in steep decline. And they weren't even just concentrating on songbirds. They were looking at all types of birds and considering habitats and different groups of birds, like water birds versus shorebirds, et cetera, like that. And really the result made news around the world, because they found in North America that the total loss of birds in the past 50 years adds up to about 3 billion birds, as you can see in the graph here. So to put that in context, how much is 3 billion years? Well, they estimate that's about 30% loss in bird abundance in North America in that short period of time. So that kind of sums up, not looking at it species by species, but overall, just this massive loss in bird abundance. And you can imagine, what kind of ripple effects that might have in the ecosystem, because birds are important for dispersing fruit. They're important for eating insects. I mean, they have a lot of ecological roles. And to lose that many birds in such a short period of time is going to affect things other than birds, of course. So we want to address what causes migratory bird declines. And as I mentioned briefly, I'm not going to get into the details on this, of course, but there are things happening on the breeding grounds that reduce reproductive success. So forest fragmentation or grassland fragmentation and loss of those critical habitats are, of course, part of the reason why populations have declined, they're just not as much habitat for them. And the same applies to the wintering grounds, where we have massive deforestation and conversion to agriculture. And even the native grasslands are being converted to agriculture as the human population has exploded. And we also have a great deal more international trade in food, for instance. And so, the food that's grown in Central and South America in the wintertime, a lot of that is shipped up to North America and Europe, so we can have our veggies and fruit in the wintertime. So we actually know quite a bit about breeding ground effects on bird declines and wintering ground effects on bird declines. What we don't know very much about is what's happening during migration. And that's because it's really hard to study an individual bird that's traveling thousands of kilometers each way on its journey. And so we don't necessarily have all the technology we need to be able to trace what is happening to individuals, what habitats they're using along the way, what are the sources of mortality that they face along the way. That's really like a huge gap in our ornithological knowledge, is not knowing where and why birds are dying. We do know overall that for these small migratory songbirds, about half of them do not return to the breeding grounds the next year. And it's probably we don't know for sure, but that's probably about the normal level of mortality, something around 50%. These are tiny little birds. And so they're not really expected to live a really long time when they're undergoing these massively long journeys. But even so, with that 50%, where does this mortality happen and why? So to give you sort of a feel, you might have a species like the Wilson's warbler, which breeds across most of the boreal forest in Canada and winters in Central America. Well, of course, it's got to get back and forth. And you think of Toronto, which is where I'm from, as lying on this sort of bird superhighway where birds are coming down, they'll funnel east and they'll come down through the Great Lakes, and just massive numbers of birds travel southward over the Great Lakes during fall migration. This includes the young that were produced that year, so huge numbers of birds. And then in the spring on the reverse trip, they also come back up, as you'll see in a minute, mostly up through the Mississippi River Valley here, and again, flood through the Great Lakes region before they spread out into the boreal forest. And so, yes, we have these obstacles along the way, like the city of Toronto, for birds that are coming south from the boreal forest. This is probably their first experience, if they're juveniles, with this massively large urban environment, because there's not a whole lot north of there, like percentage-wise, that's urbanized. And we've done tracking studies quite a long time ago now on birds like the wood thrush, where we can look at individuals and their migration routes and try to get a feel for what kind of hazards they might face on their routes. And so here's an example of an individual that departs our study site where I am here in Pennsylvania, heads south down the East Coast, hopscotches to Cuba, and ends up wintering in northern Honduras here. And then in the way back, same bird, will come back up to the Yucatan. This is a typical route, cross the Gulf of Mexico, make landfall near the New Orleans, Mississippi River Delta area, and then come up the Mississippi River Valley back to return. So again, if you look at sort of what it might look like from bird's eye view, coming into the New Orleans area after this long passage over water, exhausted birds will encounter an environment, if they're near New Orleans, of again, a heavily urbanized environment, relatively little forest cover, and very few places probably to refuel. So when we put together all the migration tracks of our wood thrushes, we sort of see that this pattern, as I said, is kind of typical. These red lines, or each line is a different individual bird heading north in the spring. And you can see for birds whose breeding population is in the northeastern part of the range, most of them are taking this trip up to the Yucatan across the Gulf. And for birds in the central eastern part, which includes our study site in Pennsylvania, same thing. And so we can estimate that 70% of all wood thrushes are passing through this Mississippi River Delta region during spring migration. And of course, if you look at it on a bigger picture, this being the typical fall route, this being the typical spring return route, with a lot of variation around that, but this is the dominant route. Overlay that on an image of the light pollution at night. And you can see that these birds are traveling extensively through urbanized areas while they're in North America. And so it's quite reasonable to wonder, well, wood thrushes are declining very seriously. We've always attributed that to forest fragmentation on the breeding grounds in Eastern North America. And of course, deforestation on the wintering grounds in Central America, especially in Honduras and Nicaragua, which is their main wintering area. But as I said, we really have no idea to what extent things like colliding with buildings, with the windows, is contributing to this population decline. But certainly in terms of their movements, you can imagine that they're highly susceptible to this. So some of you have probably seen these radar images, but this is just to reinforce for a lay audience just the scale at which migration happens through the Great Lakes. This is from the NexRad radar station in Buffalo, and it's an especially impressive migration movement that was captured on radar quite a long time ago, but this is in May. And right now what you see in the image is just ground clutter. It's around 8 o'clock in the evening in May, so it's not dark yet, not like now, which gets dark at 5 p.m. Anyway, this baseball bat looking thing on the radar sort of signals sunset, so 6:20 p.m. and now the sun has gone down. And of course, these migratory songbirds mostly migrate at night, so they've been spending the day on the ground, and you can't see them in the radar right now, but they're on the ground waiting for it to get dark. And then after sunset, they take to the sky. So you get this massive cloud of birds, which are detectable by the NexRad radar because birds' bodies contain a lot of water. So the radar is designed to detect raindrops, but they also detect insect bodies and bird bodies. So you can see this massive movement, and you'll see this first wave here crossing Lake Ontario towards Toronto. This is 9:30 in the evening, 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. So the first wave has crossed the lake, and this whole sort of massive movement of birds just carries on all night long and starts to diminish in the wee hours of the morning because birds run out of fuel and they have to make landfall because they just don't have enough fat stored to keep going. And you can see at the end here, after sunrise happens, which is signaled here, just how many birds are still in high concentrations along this whole GTA area, stretching all the way from like Oshawa down to Hamilton. Just again, massive numbers of birds moving around. They need to find a place to rest for the day and refuel. And bad luck for them, they find themselves in a heavily urbanized environment. And as we know from especially with this group, some unknown percentage of those birds end up victims of window collisions. And birds do not see glass as a solid object. I mean, they can, but often they just fly right into the glass. It may be because they don't recognize the glass as a solid object, or of course it may be that vegetation is being reflected in that glass, giving them the illusion that they're flying into a vegetated area. A lot of the collisions happen in the morning, not really at night, but in the morning as birds are feeding. They're starved, they have to find food. And especially in an urban environment, there's limited opportunities for foraging. And so they may find themselves very close to buildings looking for food, and that just increases their risk of collision. So here's just an example. You guys know your birds, I'm sure: yellow warbler, white-throated sparrow, a couple of ovenbirds, gray-cheeked thrush, and the squintus thrush. These are the types of birds that are, and many others, commonly found colliding into the glass. Certainly this is true on the York University campus, but also like the Fatal Lights Awareness Program. They do the surveys in downtown Toronto. This is kind of a kind of typical collection of victims. And so the story at York, I've been working there for over 30 years now. And of course, the whole time I've been there, when you're coming in to work, it's not unusual during migration season, especially in the fall, to find dead birds in front of the windows, or somebody calls you because they found a dead bird, or a student brings one into the lab. And so, of course, we've been aware of the problem all along. It's just that it's kind of unclear, given so many buildings on campus, and not having at the time a very feasible solution for window coverings. You just kind of have to say, well, that's too bad, and the birds just keep dying. Even my favorite wood thrushes, we found a couple of those on campus. And so for many years, we've made efforts to do a few surveys to get a cost estimate on treating one of the buildings where my office is, across from a woodlot, just to see what the cost would be. Very expensive, and talking like $20,000, $25,000 just to treat one side of the building. And it's really really challenging to convince administrators who are in charge of the budget to invest that kind of money when for one single building or one single facade, you're not talking about thousands of birds dying a year, you're talking about dozens. So it's really hard to generate traction for change because the numbers killed at any one facade are relatively low compared to the cost of treating that building. So we're kind of stuck in a cost benefit or return on investment problem. But then we decided, well, why don't we at least quantify the problem? So, you can't get very far without knowing exactly what the scale of the problem is. So I had a student, Sean Chin, who decided to do his master's thesis doing systematic surveys of campus and trying to identify both the correlates of the window collisions, but also really just to find out which buildings were problem sites. And so we kind of followed the methods of Hager et al., who did these kind of surveys in Illinois, where you survey a standard number of buildings every single day, even weekends, during what's defined as a migration season. So in our case, it was 6 weeks, and you search each building with the exact same search effort and using the same methodology. So now you can compare directly the mortality rate of one facade or one building versus another. And in Hager's case, they showed the obvious expectation that buildings that have a greater window area, more glass, are going to be more likely to produce collisions. We weren't really interested in that, but it shows how you can use that kind of systematic data to answer questions about which buildings are a problem and why. So we chose 15 buildings at York U, and Sean started this project as I said, for his thesis, and his buildings are shown in a red line here. And it doesn't matter if you've never been to York U campus, every campus kind of looks the same in a way. It's pretty big. We got 50,000 undergraduates. So there's a lot of buildings to choose from, and there's not enough time in a day to check all of them. So he picked buildings, different locations on campus, different proximity to our woodlots that are on campus, different amounts of window area, different amounts of vegetation near the building. So there'd be a lot of variation between the buildings. And then after he finished, I had a student, Lisa Horn, who was doing her master's thesis on something completely different. But she lived on campus and got very engaged and alarmed about the high mortality rate, and began doing checks, a lot of the same buildings and some of the new ones, motivated a lot by rescuing birds that had been injured and taking them down to Downsview for treatment if they were still alive, but also contributing to collecting a data set that we could then present to the university and make a good case for which building should be treated and what kind of, as I said, return on investment they would be likely to get. And one thing that Sean did extra was to go through the sort of tedious but necessary process of estimating search effort efficiency, and also to estimate predator removal efficiency. And we could have done this by taking average numbers from other studies, but really both of these efficiencies will vary geographically and vary perhaps with the methodology of the exact study. And when you look at other studies, there's a lot of variation in those percentages. And so we decided to do it ourselves. And so it involved, for the first one, for search efficiency, getting birds from our unfortunately large collection in the freezer. And when our teams were going out doing searches, unbeknownst to them, we would place a carcass by a building, and we knew that the carcass was there, and then we would wait and find out, measure, we'd know at the end of the day when they came back from doing the surveys whether or not they had found that carcass. So there was always two people in a search team, And some of them, performed a little bit better than others. But on average, it was pretty high. Like I think it was over 90% or something like that of those specimens were found by our search team. And then we did the same sort of thing with predators because we know that, the predators may get there before we do. And so we would go out very, very early in the morning, as soon as feasible, and set out carcasses and then go back. And then our team would go back later, this time knowing where they are, and determine whether it had been removed either by a predator and sometimes the custodial staff would be around cleaning up, and they would clean up clean up the carcasses, and we'd never know about that. So there's different reasons why the carcasses might disappear before a search team gets there. But it turned out that this is actually fairly important, even though it's kind of tedious to do, because the actual number killed, we estimate, is about 25% more than the number that we find around the buildings. So again, in terms of communicating with the university around the scale of the problem, you might be really underestimating things if you don't go ahead and determine what that percentage is for your particular study site and circumstances. Because of course, the predator community is going to vary a lot from campus to campus. And your search team might vary a lot in terms of how well trained they are. This student here is one of our research volunteers who was doing it for one migration season. And yeah, I don't think it takes a huge amount of training to learn how to walk around a building and look for dead birds. But nevertheless, we did find that there was variation among individuals, perhaps in their focus. Maybe it's weather related. It's a cold, nasty day and people are in a hurry to get their search over with and get to class. We don't really know, what the source of the variation is, but it is important because, there are some studies where this value is 50%. So you could be really underestimating. So again, it doesn't matter if you've been to York campus or not. This was our approach in presenting our data over several years to the university, and that is to have multiple years of data to be able to show the number of casualties per migration season. So this is fall and spring, and then fall again. Total, and then we increase the number by 25% to estimate the actual number killed, and then put them in rank order here. So it was clear which buildings were the top problems. So the number one, and we didn't search all the buildings. It's not feasible unless you have a massive crew of people to do the searches. But this Schulich courtyard, as they call it, this is the Schulich School of Business. And this is their executive dining room back in here, where all the fancy people go for fancy lunches, like the deans and provost and such, and people are being interviewed for jobs. So inside there is the fancy dining room, but as they look out into this nice courtyard, it's actually blocked off on all sides by the building. So it's kind of a dead end courtyard, and it's got a lot of vegetation in here. And so birds are attracted to the vegetation, and then they're kind of trapped in there and hit the windows. So we were estimating, and I think this is really conservative, and at least 71 birds a year are being killed at that site. Life Sciences building is another site. It's just a totally glass building. The Bethune Walkway is another classic where there's a glass, a walkway between two buildings with glass on either side. There's vegetation on both sides. So birds literally think they can fly right through there. And even though this is a small area, it's actually the third worst location on campus. So here we have an example of, thinking about return on investment, that the Schulich courtyard, not only is it a large area, especially to treat the second floor up here, but it's also the Schulich School of Business, and they don't like people telling them what to do. They sort of operate almost as a university within a university. And so there are political ramifications as well of trying to work with the Schulich School of Business and see if we could get that building treated. So the bottom line is we were able to identify, the top 5 worst areas, and then the university met with their facilities, the head of facilities, to present these data and make the case, again, based on return on investment, that these first 2 sites are actually kind of large. So we didn't ask for the whole Life Sciences building to be treated, but only the north side of it, because there was a line of trees that was attracting birds on that side. But even so, that's a big area of glass that we're talking about. The Bethune Walkway is a small area like this. Founders College, one of the residences, there were just a few small areas that were a problem. Same with this Pond Road residence. It was a courtyard, and there's really reflective glass in one corner. That's where the problem was. So we had like our two top sites, unfortunately, were also the two most expensive to treat. So what do you problem? Well, fortunately, we have the feather-friendly dot pattern available through 3M. And so you can retrofit existing windows with this high-density spot pattern, and that makes the glass visible to birds. And other data have shown that it reduces mortality rate by over 50%. And so this seemed to be the most sensible solution. And also, as we were talking to the facilities people, they were very happy with this solution because the only thing applied to the window is actually the dot. So this is not a window film that's with a whole sheet that sticks to the window. It's just the little dots that stick to the window. And this is hugely important because with facilities, if you put a film on the window, it can compromise the warranty on the window, and it also compromises the heating and cooling patterns that go through the glass. And so they were not interested in anything at all that was a solid film. And if you turn back the clock 10 or 15 years ago, the only thing available really was a film, and it was just not possible for them to really apply. So the new buildings in Toronto now do require bird-friendly glass on the lower levels. So like the new buildings that are being put in the last 3 or 4 years at York U and the new subway stations there, they all have the fritted glass and the dots on the glass built in. But the problem is, of course, with a campus like ours, we have a lot of old buildings like the Schulich and Bethune, where that problem will be ongoing forever until the glass is either replaced or we treat the glass. And yeah, the basic problem, as I mentioned earlier, is window treatments cost money, and universities, generally speaking, are overflowing with surplus money that they're looking for a way to spend. So the sort of chronology of how this came about, and it involved quite a bit of luck, I think, was in fall of 2017, once we had Sean Chin's master's data, I gave a presentation to the York U Sustainability Council, which seemed like a good way to start because the people sitting around the table are, of course, faculty members, but it also includes people like the provost and head of facilities. So I gave my presentation, sent a few emails, sent my report to a few people, and nothing happened, which I wasn't really surprised at. The next year, we had some more data that Lisa Horn had collected. And this time I had a one-on-one meeting with the director of York U Facilities to present our latest bird collision data, to present the feather-friendly solution. And basically was told they don't have any money. Like, everybody's very sympathetic. No one likes to see pictures of dead birds. But the answer was, well, we don't have any money, maybe next year. So after that, I went away and built some support amongst faculty members in science and environmental studies who work in the area of conservation, not even necessarily birds. And so we sort of came together and sent a sort of a joint communication to the various deans, saying what needed to happen. One of our faculty members, who's a former lawyer, also sent a letter to the Faculty of Science and Facilities explaining some of the legalities that in Ontario, building owners have a duty to minimize bird kills and show due diligence. So if they know that bird kills are occurring, which we've told them is the case, then they have to do something about it. Maybe not solve the entire problem, but they have a legal obligation to show due diligence. And I think that letter is what really was the turning point, along with a little bit of good luck. Because as it turns out, in June, there was a new director of facilities. The guy that had been there before for years and years and years had retired. And so the second in command had become the new acting director. And I had known her for a long time, and she's interested in bird watching and had sort of seen my various media coverages in the past. I was very sympathetic. So when I went to meet with her in June to try again, with the new spring data to get something done, I went in there already with my ammunition, so to speak, with my charts and my tables and ready to like really push hard. And when I sat down with her, the first words out of her mouth was, "Bridget, this is terrible. We have to treat the windows." And I was just so shocked that after all those years of trying to get some sort of movement on the part of the university, finally there was somebody with knowledge about the problem, with empathy about the problem, and also with the authority to go ahead and set aside a chunk of money, almost $100,000, to go ahead and treat the windows that fall. So that was just extremely lucky coincidence. But again, you know, the build up was like doing the presentations, having the data to show, having the meetings, and luckily it all worked out. So amazingly enough, the very first window treatments were installed just a few months later in early October at the top 5 problem sites that we'd identified in that table. So here's an example of the Schulich executive dining room, the fancy tables in the background. You can see the dot pattern now on the windows. So I had some fun, you know, back when we were actually on campus, that's where they always have receptions for various events and things. And so it was nice to sort of be able to take the provost aside and say, hey, you see the dots on the window? Do you know what these are for? And explain, you know, the tie between the dots and the bird collisions and the presentation I'd given at Sustainability Council. And it all kind of came together that it's that simple just to treat the windows and then it's done. I mean, these aren't permanent, but they're going to last a long time. Here's the Bethune walkway showing that the window dots on there. Again, this is a pretty small area to treat. I think it took the installation guys maybe 2 hours to treat these windows on both sides. And so, yeah, it's a pretty routine matter to actually do the installation once somebody who controls the budget gives approval. And we did have a chance that fall 2019, although the installations happened, unfortunately, a little bit later than we wanted. They were supposed to be done in August, but then they had to, you know, go through the whole routine of getting different companies to bid on the project, and that delayed the whole thing. But even though the treatments were done at various days in October, depending on the weather, because it has to be warm enough to do this, you can see it again. As scientists, we would not be so convinced by this, but it is kind of convincing if you look at the number of birds found dead at that site before it was treated versus afterwards. We only found 1 dead bird afterwards. And we think we're pretty sure this one hit the 2nd story based on where it was located. So these treatments, like at Life Sciences, are only on the 1st floor because we're assuming that birds are feeding in the vegetation. The vegetation is kind of low. So we're assuming that most of the collisions are happening on the 1st floor. And again, that saves a ton of money if the university doesn't have to treat like 2 or 3 stories worth of a large building. So these were pretty convincing data. And our plan, of course, was to go back in spring of 2020 and continue the surveys and compare not before and after like this, but to look at the entire spring collision data for 2020 and compare that to the spring of the year before to make sort of a better comparison. Oh yeah, and then the other good thing that came out of this was that this is a good news story. And so York put it out on their Y-File, sort of their webpage, and got some media traction. And so we got a little CTV news coverage and a nice article in Toronto Star that was, you know, really good publicity for the university. So at least from their point of view, not that this can always be successful, but that certainly helped to give them the positive feedback that they had made a good decision to treat the windows. And not only, you know, scientifically was it going to reduce bird collisions, but it also brings in some nice media coverage for them as well, which is a bonus. All right, so our plan was to keep going with the bird surveys and go down the list, a few more to get to the sort of medium problem sites, and also to start searching other sites where we were pretty sure there would be a problem just based on the arrangement of the site. But then COVID came along and we haven't done any bird surveys at all the last couple of years. So unfortunately, we don't have the new data to be able to really show the before and after effect. And we haven't been able to go and identify new sites. But again, the good news, again, small good news, is that Facilities has set aside a much smaller budget every year. And each fall they contact me to find out which sites we want to identify for treatment. So it's not there's not going to be 5 buildings. It might be 2 sites, but at least they're continuing this. And so here's a site that this is a kind of our food court area. And so this is an area where we'd found quite a few birds before COVID came along, and just the whole, again, it's one of those cut off courtyards with trees lining the area. And then this reflective glass right at the end as birds are trying to escape out of there. So yeah, we said, do the York Lanes entrance, and they did. And we said, do Osgood Law School North Side, and they did. So it's really exciting that the university just didn't do this as a one-off, but they're continuing to engage, despite the funding difficulties they've been having the last couple of years. So of course, the campus has a lot of buildings and windows, and really the first facilities guy that I talked to, that was kind of his point. He said, what's the point of treating 5 buildings if there's like 50 buildings on campus? We're just not really going to make much of a difference. But we have, because now there have been 7 sites that have been treated. And when we add up the estimate number of birds saved, it's in the hundreds of birds per year. And of course, these window dot treatments last many, many years. And so we think at those buildings, at least, we've cut down the mortality rate by at least 75%, which is a huge win. And it's certainly true that many large buildings that we searched caused almost no bird fatalities. For instance, we have the Ontario Archives building on campus. There's absolutely no vegetation anywhere near it. So there's just no birds around, and almost none were found. Other buildings are really, really old buildings with like tiny, tiny little windows and a lot of brick. And again, those ones have very few collisions. So I think it is feasible to even for a large campus like this, to set up the survey so that it's manageable time-wise, and you're hitting the sites, surveying the sites that are most likely to be problematic, and not wasting time searching sites that you're pretty sure, because of their size or window area or lack of vegetation, are just not going to be a problem. And then another question that comes up often is whether real collision data is really necessary, because, like Sean was out there searching. It took him 2 or 3 hours to search his buildings every single day for 6 weeks in a row, and he didn't even live on campus. He had to commute, from Mississauga to do this. So it's a huge effort time-wise to actually get the data. And had to do that like 4 migration seasons in a row to get 2 years of data. But as time consuming as that is, the university was extremely responsive to my tables showing number of birds dead and these pictures showing dead birds, because they can't kind of turn their back on the problem as easily when it's not theoretical, like this building is by a woodlot and has a lot of glass, it's probably a problem. When you actually show the numbers of birds dead and show them pictures of them and how pretty they are, it does hit home. But again, like in my case, it wasn't until I had a sympathetic administrator in charge that anything was actually done about it. And then the Fatal Ice Awareness Program has since created this sort of bird safe campus resources. And has examples of other campuses. So Yorkview, of course, is not the only campus making these kinds of efforts of doing surveys and getting universities to do retrofits. This example here from Trent University is a new construction. So again, new constructions are totally different ballgame, because the university has to put up glass to make their building. So their choice is like, what kind of glass are they going to use? And that's very different than an older building where they have a choice of doing nothing at all and spending no money versus doing the treatments. And so really it is the retrofitting of buildings, which is most problematic in terms of getting the campus on board. And even for something like replacing windows, we had a construction at one of the biology buildings a couple of years ago during all of these negotiations and things like that I was doing. Where they redesigned the foyer of the biology building and turned it from a tiny glass door into a big glassed-in 2-story glass foyer. And it never occurred to them to get bird-friendly glass as part of their installation. It wasn't until after it was built that it's like, wait a minute, when we replace windows or do small renovations to buildings, we should be putting in this permanent fritted or bird-friendly glass. So somehow or another, even though they had the knowledge, just the process by which building renovations are done through the university facilities, it's really hard to get that message and culture entrenched. I would say it takes years, perhaps, for the bird safe glass concept to really become part of the culture. And then finally, just wanted to talk briefly about the bigger picture again. These kinds of studies, of course, have been done all across Canada in different settings, houses, the low mid-rise buildings like we have on campuses, the tall high-rise buildings like flat checks. And this is sort of, everybody's heard this quote, I'm sure, or this result, is that this study back in 2013 that tried to put it all together and sort of systematically estimate bird mortality in Canada from bird window collisions came up with a number around 25 million birds killed per year. And about 10% of these are at these sort of low mid-rise buildings like we have on campuses. And so the potential to reduce numbers killed is quite high compared to, say, working with tall buildings where, although the buildings are gigantically tall, doesn't necessarily contribute as much to the overall problem. So the easy message is that window collisions are avoidable. You just have to make the windows visible to birds and can reduce overall bird mortality from window collisions by over 10% just by doing this on places like campuses where we do have the kind of setting of a park-like environment with vegetation and such, but also, of course, the glass. So a good question, though, when we, as we sort of go back to what I started with, looking at bird declines, and I'm not questioning at all the importance and ethics of treating windows, and I agree. Like if you know windows are killing birds, you have a legal and ethical obligation to do something about it. But at the same time, you can sort of ask scientifically, to what extent would large-scale window treatments actually change the trajectory of some of these population declines? And so interestingly, the top bird that we find dead on campus over and over again is a white-throated sparrow. These are extremely common north of campus, so they come through in the fall, and their foraging habits tend to be low to the ground for whatever reason. We just find many of these every year. And curiously enough, the white-throated sparrow is not declining in North America. You can see the breeding bird survey data here. Second most common bird that we find is the ovenbird, the forest bird and ovenbird. We find a bunch of those every year. Very common. Don't really know exactly why they're so vulnerable to windows, but again, they're very common warblers that occur in a large geographic range, north and south of Toronto. And again, the ovenbird is not declining either. This isn't to say that we know a lot of them must be killed by windows, but they're not declining, strangely enough. So the possibility is there that that despite the large numbers found dead, that percentage-wise, this is not having a big impact on their overall population. And then finally, going back to what I was talking about near the beginning, is that we also don't know where mortality is the greatest. So whether you're tracking something like wood thrushes, which we've done, or if you're doing ovenbirds, white-throated sparrows, we also had to fly back and forth. At least the ovenbirds are going to the Caribbean and Central America. White-throated sparrows are probably going to the southern US. They have to go through this urban obstacle course as well. But we have no idea for any bird species what percentage of individuals that begin migration die because of flying into windows. Because we don't have any tracking devices that will indicate the location where a songbird actually dies. Our current tracking devices are archival, so we can only get data, say for wood thrushes, who survive the entire journey, which is only about like 40 or 50% of them will come back carrying their backpacks. We can get the data and find out where they went. But we don't have any tracking devices yet that allow us to know exactly where a bird died. And so we have no idea if they're dying in cities or dying crossing the Gulf of Mexico or anywhere along the route. And so that's a huge gap in our knowledge. And again, in terms of trying to understand, we find birds dead under windows in large numbers, but translating that into an effect on their overall population trajectory and potential for recovery from declines, and how window collisions weigh up compared to, say, other sources of mortality. We just have really no idea at all. And we won't until we can get tracking devices that give us those mortality signals and locations. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now and just see if people have questions that I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, if anybody would like to, go on video and unmute themselves to ask a question, I'd welcome that. Give it a few
I'm just checking the chat room while we're doing that. Somebody's asking about collisions before and after COVID-19 lockdown, when there were less people on campus. Well, certainly at York U in spring of 2020, there was only a skeleton crew on campus, and same in fall 2020. The entire campus was closed to students. So I'm not sure to what extent the office lighting would affect collisions, because a lot of the collisions happen in the daytime. And so I'm not sure it really matters if somebody's lights are on or not. But I suppose it's possible that the nocturnal lighting, like there is safety lighting at night. Anyways, I mean, I think even during the lockdown, they had the sort of pathway lights and essential safety lighting on. But that's a good question. I don't know if anybody studied that. Does anyone know that? Whether local lighting sources, affect probability of collision or attract more birds to the area, in which case there'll be a higher probability of collision. Unfortunately, nobody was on campus to do the bird surveys, but in theory, it's a good question. Yeah, interesting.
Right. And I'm interested too in what you just said there, that most of the collisions are diurnal.
That's what we believe, yeah, because at nighttime the birds aren't moving around. So yeah, when they come down, presumably when they come down to ground after a flight, they'll find some sort of habitat. That's the plus side of urban lighting, is that they can see just fine, and they can locate vegetated areas. Let's hope for their landfall, so to speak. But then once the sun comes up, they got to move around and find food. And I guess, again, I don't know if anybody's done any sort of like technical study to determine exactly what time of day collisions occur. I'm not quite sure how you'd logistically do that. Suppose you could videotape windows and see when it happens. I don't know if there is data on that or not.
We have some from our work in Cleveland, and I'll talk a little bit about that next month.
You're good. Any preview answer?
Yeah, so we run the same routes in our downtown Cleveland surveys continually throughout the morning. So volunteers are passing by sites. So we do have not direct time, but basically within 30 to 60 minutes of when a bird hits. And it's as you would expect. A lot of it's happening after sunrise. Typically, and it varies.
Do you think people traffic flushes the birds into the windows at all? Because we at least on campus, people move around every hour. Between classes, there's this massive surge of people moving around. So it might be interesting to compare collision rates when everybody's sequestered in their classrooms versus the big switch that happens every hour, with sidewalks being full and people cutting across corners. And I don't know if there's much information on that.
Yeah, that would be for sure be really interesting. We don't have that. I mean, downtown Cleveland is busy at all times. And even here at Ohio State, it's pretty busy throughout the morning and not necessarily quiet at certain times. So we have students monitoring campus here as well, and they find things, but we've not seen that. We don't really have that time schedule like you have, but it would be really interesting if you could set up a study to look at that. It would be interesting.
Yeah, on the most part, the students are on the pathways, and then the birds are in the vegetation near the buildings, and they don't really overlap on the most part. I think the birds go about their business and so do the people. And it's not like students are running up to the bushes going, ah, you know. Yeah. So anyone else has experiences of like Guelph on trying to get the university to treat windows?
It was interesting to hear your experience with just the one person really making a big difference. And that's been sort of our experience as well. Like it really comes down to individual managers or people of influence. We've had a difficult time here in various city projects and on the university campus as well. And sometimes it's just one person makes a big difference. So continually trying and eventually you'll find that one person seems to work out.
Yeah, to your question,
Can be
Bridget,
discouraging though.
there have been efforts on the University of Guelph campus. We haven't got the support of, the data. We don't have the monitoring data because we've encountered issues, of course, with COVID and bringing students on campus. But perhaps the data that's available from monitoring programs like yours and like Brendan's and Matthew's here could support something like that. And we've also been raising funds in hopes to maybe offer a matching funds towards treating windows sort of opportunity.
Yeah, the other thing we explored was window art to sort of have more of a student engagement, and the faculty of environmental studies, who've renamed themselves now, but whatever they're called, but they put in an application to our academic innovation fund, where you're getting money from the university to do something creative with your coursework. And so they had planned to launch a window design competition as part of 2 or 3 of their courses. And then every spring they used to have, before COVID, they used to have like a eco festival. And so they were going to do the sort of unveiling of the window art. And so it wasn't really so much to reduce window collisions, because the irony is that their building wasn't really that bad with respect to window collisions, but it would be highly visible and a good educational opportunity and get a lot of publicity for the university to do this annual window art event. I think it was UBC has done that as well, and I think University of Manitoba has done a little bit of that. But again, unfortunately, that was all shelved when the campus shut down. But it was an interesting idea that just helps to generate awareness by the students and by the faculty, and then whatever university communications, somehow or another. I mean, I would guess the people in facilities, they go to a whole bunch of meetings with the bigwigs at the university. So trying to get that conversation started about window art, and I guess UBC has got some permanent installations with window art. They were just going to put on temporary ones because it's so cheap, so it would be expected to last maybe 6 months, and then they would take it down. You're literally just painting on the window, so it probably wouldn't last the winter. But then by next spring, you get it up in time in April for spring migration, and again it lasts through the fall migration. So it sort of becomes an annual event. So I don't know if they have plans to resume that. It's just the future of education, in-person education in crowded rooms is kind of in question. So I don't know if they're going to try to go ahead with that this term or not, actually. Should find out. I would guess some of the like York, at least, we're all going back in person in January. But even so, it wouldn't surprise me if some instructors are sort of limiting some of the high density situations that might, if they can avoid it.
Definitely, but I don't see why that would have to prevent, design creation and execution on an outdoor surface. So hopefully that's something that we can bring. I
think it's probably more the transition from everybody being online last year to now being back in person, and not having a whole lot of warning about this. From an instructor's perspective, that I don't know if they've been able to revise their courses and build in these new activities, or whether it'll be in a year, but hopefully that'll resume. Yeah.
Mhm. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
I had like kind of a two-parter question, and also wanted to apologize for my my interruption earlier.
That's okay. This is pretty informal.
Yeah, he did catch part of the talk though, so he was very interested. That was great. My question, so I was really interested in what you were saying at the end about the white-throated sparrow and the ovenbird, and how we haven't really seen declines in those species, and yet they represent such a high number of window strikes. The two-part question is, one, I was wondering if there's been any study that has looked at the age of window killed birds to see if there are more like first year, second year birds that have been killed than adults, because my immediate thought was, oh, if it was an adult bird, an experienced breeder that was killed, that might have more demographic consequences than if it was a first year inexperienced breeder. And then the second part of it is there a species that could be a good like poster child of sorts as a species that is declining that does account for a large number? One example I thought of was the wood thrush from Carl's work over here, but also you've been talking about wood thrush as well. But just like in terms of pitching it to people, I don't know if there's a good species to bring up as this bird gets.
Yeah, for your first question, yeah, a lot of, for a lot of these birds, especially if they're dead, you can age them for a lot of species based on their plumage characteristics, or maybe the ossification of their skulls. But remember, like in the fall, you would expect probably, I'm roughly guessing, about 50-50 juvenile to adults, just based on the demographics. Like probably 50% of the birds flying over Toronto are juveniles that time of year. So somehow or another, you didn't need to, take that into account. But yeah, I mean, if you were to find 90% juvenile and 10% adult, that would be quite different than the expected. And then you'd start wondering, well, is it because they're inexperienced and they're coming from the boreal north and they have no idea what a building is, let alone a high rise or a city? It's possible. And then the second part of your question for poster child, yeah, that is the irony, that you're going to find more dead birds for common species, just by the numerical fact of it. And I guess we still don't know a lot about why some species might be, like, aside from their numerical dominance or abundance, that they might be actually more vulnerable because of their visual abilities or their foraging style. And so maybe that some species, aside from their numbers, are a little bit more vulnerable just because of whatever, we don't really understand why. But yeah, it is like wood thrush. We found hundreds and hundreds of dead birds over the years, and only 2 or 3 wood thrushes that whole time. Why? Because the northern limit of their breeding range isn't much farther north than Toronto. So we're already at the northern edge of the range, and then they're just generally an uncommon bird compared to, for instance, a red-eyed vireo or an ovenbird or something like that. And so trying to make that link between species at risk and window collisions is kind of like, you can do it, but scientifically speaking, it's like, yeah, well, how many of this uncommon declining species are actually, what percentage of those are actually being killed by windows? And then the second aspect of it, which sounds kind of mean, but like, we know half the birds that are leaving the boreal forest are going to die before the next year anyhow. So what difference does it make if they die flying into a window or die flying across the Gulf of Mexico? It's not additive. You can't die both ways. You can only die one way. And so, yeah, making the link back to population declines is kind of tricky, I think. But nevertheless, I think as a pitch to administrators who aren't necessarily scientists, you can kind of get away with a bit of leeway there. And yes, show that we are finding species at risk on campus among some of the casualties, and that these are the species who can least afford to lose even a handful of individuals. And if it's, this is what's happening at your campus, imagine what's happening across the entire GTA. And so again, it becomes an ethical responsibility. Just like as a consumer, you should be buying recycled paper products and organic bananas and such. As a university, you should be treating your worst buildings because that's the right thing to do. And if everybody did that, then we could make a collective difference. So it's the same sort of everybody doing their part philosophy.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Welcome.
Do we have any other audience questions? Because I can jump in with mine anytime.
I can ask the question.
Mhm.
Thank you, Bridget.
Elizabeth.
Hi.
Hi.
I think that was really great. And I think for this group, this was a very informative talk. I wanted to highlight some of the points you made and then kind of get some insight from you. One of the things that you talked about was it was really important to get the scale of the problem to administration by doing research on campus so they could actually see its effect happening here, which is often the problem I hear about where people don't believe it's happening there, they want proof. And then you had resistance from them until you found sort of your champion on the inside as being that key point. What do you have any advice for students, or what influence do you think a group of students like Bird Safe Guelph could have on trying to find a champion from the inside, or trying to put enough pressure on admin to actually do something?
Well, I think having faculty members helps a lot. So, like a faculty member can be the spokesperson for your group or multiple. And then if they request a meeting with facilities, then they can bring the students along. So that's what I did in my very first meeting. I had a couple of students along who had done some of the field work. And so partly so that the administrator could see that students were involved and that students don't like finding dead birds all over campus. Well, actually, most of them just walk on by and don't notice, but they don't need to know that. And so, yeah, so for a student group to get a meeting with a facilities head and have them influence their thinking about, budgets and treating windows and such, you would like to think that they would treat you just as equally if you're a student as if you're like a senior faculty member. But just the dynamics, of any university and the sort of dominance hierarchies they're in, that it would be handy to have a senior faculty member or two make the request for the meeting and sort of lead the discussion, but have students there as well. And as I said, if the wrong facilities manager or an insufficient budget, it may just be impossible. But I think like a really good argument in our case, like the Bethune Walkway, is a tiny area. I mean, it costs them maybe $2,000 to treat the whole thing. And so if they're going to go back on their heels and say, we can't afford this, well, then you need to find sites and go, yeah, but, treat this one site right here. Let's at least get started. This is a multi-year project, and let's do what we can each year. And over 10 years, X amount of glass will have been covered and X amount of birds will have been saved. And so I think that, again, it's sort of like, you don't want to start too small. You don't want to pitch too small a project. But on the other hand, if you're told your big project's not possible, you go, well, how about we just do this one this year? Just at least get a culture going of every year doing a little bit at a time. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really helpful. So I know certainly myself, I'm also working with other universities at trying to get this to happen, and we're getting more and more windows covered one piece at a time, a little small windows.
Yeah, and I think it helps to point to other universities doing this. Like York really prides itself on its sustainability awards. It's like, well, if you're going to be the sustainable university with green roofs and, carpooling and electric cars and all that stuff, this is part of the package. And now, with the publicity, they can say, well, we're one of the leading universities in Canada doing this. Makes them feel like they've spent their money well. But yeah, it's kind of embarrassing if there's a big problem site and all these other universities like York is doing it and Trent is doing it, but U of T can't. It's like, come on. Becomes competitive after a while, I think.
I noticed the irony with the York campus as well, that it was the life sciences building that was one of the worst, because I think at Guelph, Summerlee is particularly bad, and that's where the bird people have their offices anyway. So it's just like, it's especially ridiculous when it's the building that houses the conservation scientists.
Yeah, exactly. I should say too, we had like the Toronto requirement to have bird-friendly glass. A few years ago, it was like pretty widely spaced dot pattern. I think it was 6 inches or something apart. And so when Lisa was doing surveys of some of the new buildings that had the bird-friendly glass, she was finding plenty of dead birds there because, their initial, and now they've upgraded it to have a better dot pattern. But, at least initially, again, trying to move from no regulations at all to at least something that might help was a big win. And so it's nice that they've been able to move it a step farther because it turns out that some of those window treatments of those newer buildings really weren't doing much good. I mean, they must have been doing some good, but Lisa found plenty of dead birds. And, some of the newer buildings are just like life sciences, it's just solid glass all the way around the whole thing. So the potential, so in terms of window area meters squared, there's a lot of it. The other irony too is that as we saw in many studies, and we found this too, vegetation near buildings attracts birds, and then they fly into the windows. So one of Sean's recommendations, it was sort of tongue in cheek, but not really. He says, well, why don't we get rid of all the vegetation around the buildings? Because the glass is there. So if you just take away the Lumbers building that my office was in, had all this ivy and stuff on the front, and then it faced onto a woodlot. And so we found lots of birds there dead. And then one year they had to it was just a couple of years ago, they had to go and redo the roof because it has a flat roof. And so the construction people, in order to access the roof and get all their vehicles in there, they cut all the ivy off at the base and it all died. We didn't find any birds after that. Even though nothing had changed on the glass, it was getting rid of all the green wall. So it's kind of interesting idea that in some cases you can manage window collisions by getting rid of the bird habitat near the buildings. But of course, the landscaping people at the university aren't going to like that very much because it's supposed to look park-like and semi-natural, but it's interesting, like especially with the green wall. I don't think you could ever got permission to cut all that down, as a bird safe student or group, like, hey, let's cut all this vegetation down and save the birds. I don't think the aesthetics of having a green campus are kind of overpowering.
Yeah, the habitat being at odds with the collisions seems like a bit of a mixed message issue.
Yeah, at least at York we have big woodlots, and you guys have your arboretum. So, I mean, you can have really good bird habitat. It just doesn't have to be within striking distance of the building, right? So,
So the dream of fully integrated habitats and city landscapes seems to be a little bit much.
It's like it's kind of like people who put their bird feeders 10 feet away from their window. They're just asking for bird tests. Like your feeder should be really far from the window or right beside the window, but not at that medium distance. But that's the distance at which we most enjoy seeing the birds. And so even well-meaning people can inadvertently increase the collision rate by putting the feeder at a deadly distance,
True.
How depressing.
No, it's they're all actionable. So it's only depressing if there's nothing we can do, right? I had a question I had two questions actually. So the first one was, I was pretty shocked when you had that table and it showed homes versus campuses, or what was it? Homes versus first story commercial buildings, and homes being.
Yeah, it was like homes, medium buildings and high rises basically.
And so it seems that maybe, while it's important to be targeting these institutions like universities, we should also have a sharp focus on individuals at their home fronts.
That's sort of like the cat problem, that any individual cat is probably not devouring thousands of birds, but there's just so many cat owners at individual homes that it becomes a huge problem. So it's the same in any home with any sort of natural habitat around. You're probably going to hear that clonk on the window once in a while. So even the house I'm in here right now is in the middle, right by a forest, and it's beautiful country rural area. And I would guess maybe 10 birds a year, maybe fly into a window here or there.
Wow. Pretty
Pretty small number, but expected given the natural setting.
Mm-hmm.
But still, you multiply that by however many thousands of homes there are in the county, and you go, wow, that's a lot of dead birds. So yeah, it's certainly individual education. And again, like even with the big buildings on campus, with a particular house, you know which windows are the problem. Like it's not the entire, all the windows in the house. Usually it's like the patio window or this window here at the corner because you have glass on a corner. So they think they can cut through the corner. So the individual windows can be treated by homeowners using the same feather-friendly product. You just stick it on yourself on the outside of the window. It's really easy to install. So it's a good, there is an opportunity, but again, what percentage of people are going to bother? Pretty low, but in theory, through homeowner education and maybe even subsidized window applications, there might be a way to generate, some interest and publicity through working with private homeowners.
Yeah, which also brings me to the other question. You mentioned that there was reluctance to use full window films, so that the dots were preferred to full window film, and that was because of heating and
They
cooling.
don't influence. They don't influence the heating and cooling of the building, because that's huge. I mean, windows are hugely important for letting in the sun and heating up the building. And so, yeah, I mean, I know nothing about buildings and engineering and such, but
Fair.
Covering the glass with a solid film is a big no-no, and it also, ruins the warranty on your glass. So if it breaks, then you got to buy your new window or replace them all. So yeah, so that innovation with the little dots that are applied, on a commercial scale is really a breakthrough, I think, for window treatments and being able to. I mean, there are other options. But I mean, most of them are even involve like putting etching on the window, which I don't think the university would like. Go around and etch the glass on the window, is retrofitting. But the window dots seem like quite a reasonable solution because they're very easy to put on. And again, if there's specific sites or the first floor only or the north side only, like you can look at a building and go, there's no vegetation on the 3 other sides of the building. We only have to treat the first story on the north side. That's manageable,
Has there been any discussion with the bird dot company? I can't remember what they're called, but about having like a sort of buy in bulk sort of thing for universities?
They do offer bulk prices. Yeah.
So, when you're saying $90,000 for the treatment, that was all dots and not other methods.
That was all the dot treatment, and that didn't include, yes, it did. It did include labor because they, at one point they were talking about having the university facilities staff do the installation to save money, but then they ended up just contracting it out.
I wonder if that's something that could be implemented as, because they design it so that you can install it by yourself at home, right? I'm wondering if it would be possible to get a whole bunch of keen student volunteers to do it, or is that something that the university had a problem with in your case?
We were gonna do that at the Bethune Walkway, to show up on a weekend when no one's around and put it on without permission. But you can't, you don't own the building, and so you're not really supposed to go to the university's building and mess with their windows. Although it is true, like who would even notice? Probably, but that's something probably a student group could get away with, but maybe not a faculty member. But yeah, we had considered doing that in a couple of small sites. But instead we, if nothing else, like again, you're saying you're going to raise your own money. If you're able to raise your own money and get permission to put it on the building, on the windows, because everybody else is doing it, then the university might not object to you doing the installation as long as there's no ladders involved. Ladders are dangerous, and et cetera, because they would be concerned about safety and some places they have unions, and so non-unionized people cannot mess around with the buildings or do any activities. So it can get complicated.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a lot of levels there, but hopefully we can get something like that going at U of G.
Yeah, again, my suggestion is have big plans, but be willing to go small if that's all you can get out of the university.
Yeah.
Get some publicity too. Do you guys have like, get publicity about it, because universities always like good publicity.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of that going now. We've got our bus shelters, decorated with feather-friendly dots, and a city hall window decorated. So we're hoping that attracts the right attention at the university, and we can use that momentum. Well, it's 6:30, and I'm sure Bridget's got dinner and other
Time
plans.
for dinner.
So if everyone's questions are pretty well answered, or if not, you can always send an email, I'm sure. But
All
thank
right.
you so much,
Good
Bridget,
luck
for
with
your
your,
time.
good luck. Nice to
Yeah.
meet everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks, bye.